Yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm Nick Sutton. I'm from the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and I'm here at the moment in Birmingham, where I'm working nearly all the time now. The subject for today's talk is Dharma. What is Dharma? And what I want to do is take this in two parts. First of all, I want to consider the different meanings of Dharma that we encounter across the traditions, we might say, because Dharma is a concept that's shared by Buddhism and Jainism as well. And having looked at that, I then want to focus the discussion more directly, particularly on what are known as the Purusharthas, the four Purusharthas, which are in many places in the early text stated to be the four goals of human life that we should, or we can legitimately aspire for. And what I want if you like, the thesis I'm going to be presenting is the centrality of Dharma in all four of the Purusharthas, even Moksha, liberation, spirituality. So first of all, what is Dharma? It's a question that we often get asked. It's a term that's so common that I don't usually italicize it anymore, considering it to be a part of the English language rather than a foreign or Sanskrit word. There's a number of different meanings, most of which center around the idea of right action, behaving properly in the world. But as well as that, we should be aware that in philosophical writings, Buddhist and Hindu, the word dharma has another sense, and it's the sense of an object that is real. And that's important, particularly in debates between Buddhists and others, because the Buddhist argument, the Shunyavad, is that there are no dharmas. There is nothing that is real because everything changes moment by moment. So their philosophy is no dharmas. And then the counter arguments coming from Vedanta, Sankhya, and Yoga demonstrate that there are dharmas, there are objects that are fully real. I think perhaps a more subtle advance on that concept is that Dharma isn't only the object of itself, it is the essence that makes an object what it is. It's the defining characteristic of an object. So we might say that the Dharma of fire is heat and light. The Dharma of the sun is illuminating the universe, because if there's no heat, there's no light, it's not fire. So that's what defines it. And I think that's interesting for our wider discussion that we're going to have today, because if Dharma is the defining characteristic of an object, a thing, or a living being, it's like tigers have Dharma. Tigers' Dharma is to kill and eat other animals, etc. That's what essentially defines it as a tiger. The defining quality of a human being is also Dharma. And as we'll see, Dharma means purity, virtue, and proper action. And I think that's significant, because very often when someone's behaved badly, selfishly, greedily, you'll hear the remark, well, it's only human nature to act in that way. But from the perspective of the idea of Dharma as the defining quality of a thing, it's just the opposite. To behave with purity, with virtue, compassion, and kindness is what it means to be fully human. That's the fullest expression of our humanity. And when we fall away and we become roguish, self-centered, greedy, harming others, that isn't human nature. That's a loss of our humanity. So I think that's significant, looking at Dharma from the philosophical perspective. But there's more that could be said if we were having a talk on Indian philosophy. But let's move on a little bit, perhaps what is more relevant to our own lives and our own understanding of Dharma, which, if I could broadly define it, would be right action, proper action. proper conduct, living in the proper way, the right way. But then under that heading, obviously the question arises, what is right about action? What is it that makes an action, a form of action, right? And that's where the discussion becomes particularly complex and differences of view arise. Let me just run through a few of the possibilities that might define an action as right in no particular order. For example, ritual action is also defined as dharma. The Mimamsa Sutras, Jaimini's text on the Mimamsa philosophy, which is focused almost entirely on the Vedic text and the Vedic ritual actions. It begins with the word atato dharma jignasa. Now then, we will begin the inquiry about dharma. And what Jaimini means by dharma is the proper enactment of the Vedic ritual. And we might apply that to the contemporary setting. Dharma might be regarded as going to the temple, offering flowers, doing pujas. From a Christian perspective, going to church, taking the Mass for a Roman Catholic. It's a ritualistic action which could fall under the heading of dharma. And of course, I'll come on to this point later on. There would be then somebody, I don't know who it would be, it might even be me, who would say, what's more important, going to the church on a Sunday and performing all the rituals in church, or giving something to a very poor person that allows that person to get food today? Which is more at the heart of dharma? But we'll come on to that point there. But ritual is one, if you like, one expression, one understanding of dharma. Then another form of right action is and sometimes dharma is translated as duty. It's the duties we have, the obligations we have, the obligations to our family, to our community, to our city, to our society, perhaps even to our nation. We have obligations to them. And that would be, if we're parents, dharma means that we must provide for our children, nurture them, look after them, feed them, up until a certain age, probably about 49 in most cases these days, to care for them. Likewise, the dharma of children is to care for their parents as well. So that's a duty, that's dharma. And reneging on that is a breach of dharma. There's many verses in the early text which praise the idea that the father and the mother must be revered as the gods, served constantly. Therefore, the idea is that children have a duty towards them. And beyond that, we have a duty, and I think this is particularly relevant perhaps at the present time, we have duties and responsibilities to the community, those who live around us. I suppose in a traditional Indian setting, that would be the village communities, maybe even the caste community as well. That's perhaps one of the more positive features of the caste system, that it means that people look out for each other. I remember, for example, years ago I was in Preston, and two men I was speaking to said they were going to visit someone in hospital. And I said to one of them, "Oh, I didn't know you knew him. I didn't know." And he said, "This man's going to visit him and look out for his family because he's his friend. I'm going to look out for him because he's part of my caste community." And therefore he felt upon himself an obligation to look out and provide support in times of need. And beyond that, then we have an obligation to society as a whole. We have an obligation perhaps to adhere to the rules of society, to pay our taxes without avoidance. Sorry if that's controversial. Is it avoidance or evasion? Neither. You shouldn't do either. Because we receive benefits from living in the society, and there's what Rousseau calls a social contract. We therefore have obligations to them. There's the famous story of the death of Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, who was prosecuted for corrupting youth, which really meant telling young people what was really going on in Athenian society. But he was found guilty of corrupting youth, and he was sentenced to death for that. And the way that the death sentence was enacted in ancient Athens was that you were expected to drink poison and kill yourself, so that the sin of killing wouldn't reflect on people. And many of Socrates' friends said to him, they won't mind, they'll let you go, because if you go and flee to another city, then you can escape this unjust punishment. But Socrates replied, I've lived in Athens all my life. I derive benefit as an Athenian citizen. Therefore, it is my duty to adhere to the laws of Athens, even though they appear unjust. And he drank the hemlock and died surrounded by Plato and his other disciples. Perhaps an extreme point, but nonetheless, Dharma is also the fulfillment of those communal, familial, social obligations that we have without evasion. And again, of course, tensions will arise there. What about if you're living in Germany in the 1930s and the law is that you must persecute Jewish people? What should you do? Is that an obligation imposed upon you? What is Dharma? And I think a point that we find repeatedly made many times in the Mahabharata, there's a little phrase which comes up, Dharma sukshmosti. Dharma is subtle. You have to work it out for yourself exactly what is the proper Dharma when tensions and conflicts arise between the different understandings of Dharma. I'll talk about them in a little while. And then another understanding of Dharma is Dharma Shastra, the law books that Indian society has handed back over the centuries and which are still available to all who want them. I have a couple here on my desk readily available. Here is the laws of Manu, the Manu Smriti. Here is the Vishnu Smriti, an alternative law book. And there's also the Yajnavalkya Smriti. I couldn't find my copy of that. It's interesting, again, to look at that, because in a sense you might say, well, we don't need to think about what Dharma is, because the great rishis of the past, Manu and Vishnu himself, have given us smritis. They've given us the codes of conduct that we must adhere to. And in finding other religions, that's what they do to produce their own interpretations of what they consider to be Dharma. I'm thinking particularly of Islam with its Sharia, or Judaism with its Jewish law, and even in Christianity, the rules were not from a textual source, but were imposed, if you like, by the institution of the church. So people didn't have to contemplate for themselves what Dharma was, because they were told. The books are there. So Muslims know what Dharma is, if you like, although they wouldn't use that term, because it says in the Sharia. Now, when we come to Hinduism, here's the Sharia for you. I gave a talk some years ago on entitled Where is Our Sharia? But here it is, Vishnu Smriti, or more commonly Manu Smriti. But then the problem is, what happens if you're going through that book, finding the rules, and you find things that you think are wrong? And I know those of us who've been around the OCHS for a long time maybe recall that years ago we did a course on Hindu ethics, and we read passages from the Manu Smriti. And many of the people, I would say all of the people in the groups, all very serious, committed Hindus, when they read passages from them, they said, that's wrong. I remember one lady, it wasn't in Leicester, it was in Birmingham, said, after we'd read from the Manu Smriti, this is a really evil book, she said. And this wasn't some sort of apostate or enemy. That was her stated view. And maybe that's a little extreme, but I think what's happened over the centuries that gradually, almost without making a conscious decision, the Hindu community as a whole has decided we won't go down that route. We won't go down the Sharia route of following exactly, precisely every rule book. You can see here that's rule after rule in here, in the Manusmriti here. There's pages and pages of rules for different people, rules for women, how they should worship their husbands as gods, like that, rules of for caste. But then the question is, so what has happened is that these books have gradually been set aside within the Hindu community. I'm not sure why or whether it was a conscious decision, but Dharma Shastra now plays only a minutely small role in the life of practicing Hindus. And I think this came to a head. One example of this issue coming to a head was in the 1920s, the campaign for widow remarriage, which was forbidden in the Manusmriti. Widows must not remarry, it's stated there. But then there were girls, it also says that girls should be married before puberty. So girls were, according to Manu, getting married 8, 11, 12. And then because they were often married to older men, the older men die and they become widows. And I think it's something like 300,000 or 400,000 widows in India in the 1920s who were under 14 years of age, and they were forbidden by the Smriti law from remarrying. And so that debate took place. What should we do? Do we follow the text, the rule, the Sharia, if you like, or do we follow our own conscience, our own inner sense of justice, morality, and virtue? And I think the general decision, and again, I've discussed this with various groups of Hindus, and always the verdict comes back. It's the book that we'll put back on the shelf, and we'll retain our own sense of justice and morality, doing what is right. I would say this isn't just a modern idea that we'll put the Smriti aside. This goes right back to the Mahabharata. So I'm not just making this up, trying to sort of destroy Hinduism or anything like that by discrediting the Smritis. Even in the Mahabharata, Krishna himself speaks to Arjuna, not in the Gita, in another passage. I won't give the whole story, but basically Arjuna feels bound by an oath he's taken that he must kill Yudhishthira, because in order to keep the truth of a vow that he has taken, and he says Dharma is truthfulness, therefore I must remain truthful, therefore however unfortunate it is, I must strike down my elder brother. And Krishna comes and says, you fool, you're speaking about Dharma, you don't understand a thing about Dharma. He said, I don't dismiss the Smritis out of hand, I don't just say bin them, but at the same time, the Shastric texts, they can't relate to every single situation. And he gives an example of a rishi called Kaushika, who was famous for always speaking the truth. And then some robbers came to a village. The villagers fled with their possessions and hid in a cave in the forest. The robbers came to Kaushika and they said to him, where are the villagers hiding? And because he had this vow, I will always speak the truth, he said, over in the cave. The result was murder and plunder. Krishna says, in that situation, lying is dharma, telling the truth is adharma, the opposite. So he's making the point that you can't have rules because each situation is individual and different. And if you kind of got these rigid rules, then it becomes dysfunctional. He says at the end of that, Krishna says, and he defines the meaning of the word dharma, going back to its etymological root from the verb dri. The verb dri means to uphold, to sustain, to maintain. And Krishna says, therefore, we should understand that dharma is whatever sustains living beings, whatever is for the benefit of the living beings. And he turns to Arjuna and says, now you must decide what is dharma. I've given you a definition of dharma as whatever sustains living beings, whatever is for the good of all beings. Now you must decide. So what he's saying to Arjuna is, when it comes to dharma, I've given you a broad principle, whatever is for the benefit of all living beings, but the final decision in each and every individual situation is left up to the integrity and to the intelligence of the individual. And I think that's, broadly speaking, why Hinduism as a whole, if one can speak of such a thing, has followed Krishna's lead there, that there are broad principles that we follow, but we try to implement those situations according to the specific time and circumstances. Okay, if we move on then from the Shastras, the Smritis, which define Dharma, we can also see another definition of Dharma, and that is Dharma not as law, not as duty, but Dharma as pure virtue. And in the Mahabharata, that idea of what Dharma is epitomized by the Dharmaraj, by Yudhishthira himself, of whom it is said at the end of his life, he never committed one sinful action. And Yudhishthira demonstrates that in so many ways. His rule when he was king, everybody who in need was cared for, the widows, orphans, sick, disabled people, everybody, it was ensured that they were looked after. When after the battle, even though Dhritarashtra had treated them so abominably, and Bhima himself wanted to disregard Dhritarashtra, not give him any respect at all because he treated them so badly, Yudhishthira is all forgiveness. Every day goes and touches the feet of Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, showing compassion, showing forgiveness, tolerance. He epitomizes through the narrative form the idea of Dharma as pure virtue. And of course, Yudhishthira loathes the idea of violence constantly throughout the preparations for the Kurukshetra war. The Dharmaraj is always speaking in favor of ahimsa. We shouldn't do this. Is there no way we can avoid killing? Killing is such a terrible thing. And at the end of the battle, he's mortified. He sees himself as guilty of breaching the dharma of ahimsa. So the narrative of the Mahabharata gives us Yudhishthira as the exemplar of pure virtue, pure dharma. And this is defined as the Sanatan Dharma, the absolute Dharma. And I'll just read 2 or 3 verses that we've selected from the Mahabharata, which I think define perfectly this idea of Dharma as pure virtue. Never displaying malice towards any living being through actions, thoughts, or words. Acts of kindness, giving in charity. This is the Sanatan Dharma adhered to by righteous persons. Another verse here, later on in the Mahabharata. Not harming, honesty, remaining free from anger, charity are the 4 practices you must adhere to, Yudhishthira. This is the Sanatan Dharma. And then again, this is in the Shanti Parvan. The wise say that Dharma is whatever is based on love for all beings, sarvam priya, priya, love. This is the characteristic mark that distinguishes Dharma from adharma, Yudhishthira. And then perhaps just one more. This again is from the Anushasan Parvan of the Mahabharata. Amongst righteous persons, compassion is the great mark of Dharma, the characteristic of Dharma, and compassion is always a source of delight for the righteous persons. So this is another way in which Dharma is expressed. It's not rules, it's not duties, it's not obligation, it's simply a view of the world that is utterly and absolutely benign, always looking for the good, the welfare, the protection, the upliftment of others, very much as Krishna has said earlier, acting on behalf of, for the benefit of others. And finally, another way in which Dharma is understood, particularly perhaps in Buddhist and Jain teachings as well, Dharma is the path to enlightenment. Dharma is the lifestyle, the conduct the way of living which leads one towards towards liberation from rebirth. And in the Buddhist context, that means the life, the monastic life of the monk, meditation, renunciation. This is the Moksha Dharma. And within the Mahabharata, again, there's about 200 chapters in the Shanti Parvan, which are devoted to Moksha Dharma, which means yoga practices, renunciation, living a life withdrawn from the world. I would say also that the Bhagavad Gita is also an expression, a teaching on Moksha Dharma, the path to liberation. But the Bhagavad Gita is particularly unique for a reason I want to move on to now. Because these different understandings of Dharma, which, as I've indicated, there can be tensions existing between them. I mentioned, what about if you live in a country or community which is wicked, iniquitous by nature? Should you then show loyalty to your community, to your faction, or should you follow the path of pure virtue? In the Mahabharata, we have the example of Karna, Bhishma. What should they have done? Should they have sided with Yudhishthira? Sometimes that question arises, and my children have asked me that. Why did Karna fight with Duryodhana? Karna was a good man, a decent man. Why did he follow Duryodhana? Surely he should have followed the way of virtue. What about Bhishma? Such a wise, righteous, virtuous grandfather. Still he fights on behalf of Duryodhana, although he does agree to be killed by Arjuna, but nonetheless he's stuck with his faction. And I think that tension there is the tension that we find between the social dharma of a warrior, for whom loyalty to his commander is a great principle of dharma, and then the dharma of pure virtue. They're not always congruent with one another, and we see that in the problems that Yudhishthira faces throughout, trying to be a man, not trying, but being a man of intense virtue, and at the same time trying to rule the kingdom as a king. And that involves doing things that really aren't very nice, punishing people. Whereas Bhima, on the other hand, is Kshatriya Dharma. He does his duty as a warrior and a ruler. But at the same time, we find Bhima's attitude towards Dhritarashtra when he mocks them and he points to his thigh to remind them of how he killed Duryodhana in the battle. That's what a Kshatriya does. That's an expression of his Kshatriya identity, but it grates against us. I always feel this is unpleasant. And then we're admiring of Yudhishthira's forgiveness and tolerance. But at the same time, we're made aware that when it comes to the fighting, the ruling, the execution of those duties, Bhima's Kshatriya Dharma is preferable. And so there can be tensions and conflicts between them. If we look in the Puranic stories, Prahlad, the son of the demonic Hiranyakashipu, what should he have done? Should he have turned against his father? Or should he have surrendered to his father, following the familial dharma? So it's not always easy to make the right decision. And I think with the Gita, what we see there is a reconciliation is attempted between moksha dharma and social duty. Now, years ago, I wrote a book, which there are still a few copies available. It's out of print now. I must get onto Motilal to ask them, but here it is. It's called Religious Doctrines in the Mahabharata. It came out about 20 years ago. It's out of print now. But in that book, I think I made a mistake when I wrote about the ethics in the Mahabharata. And let me explain. The Gita clearly seeks a reconciliation between dharma as social duty and social obligation, and dharma as moksha dharma, seeking liberation from rebirth. And the resolution of the apparent conflict between those two is the karma yoga, performing your actions, performing your duties, but without selfish desire. And he makes, therefore, thereby the performance of social dharma into a form of yoga, because desireless action is moksha dharma as well. So in that way, the Gita tries to draw together moksha dharma and social dharma. So, and we can understand there that, you know, whereas Arjuna and Duryodhana on the battlefield are acting in the same way as kshatriyas, the idea is that Duryodhana is doing kshatriya dharma, and for that he's elevated to the world of the gods after his death. I remember when we studied that, the Mahabharata, years and years ago in Leicester, with the group there, and I said Duryodhana goes up to Svargaloka, so does Dushasana, so even does Shakuni. And there was questions were raised, and we had to get the Sanskrit Mahabharata to check the names of those who were there, and Shakuni's there, sure enough, elevation. Why? Because he performed his dharma as a kshatriya, fighting and dying on the battlefield. But the point is, he's doing kshatriya dharma, but he's not doing moksha dharma. Arjuna, on the other hand, if indeed he has followed Krishna's direction in the Gita, he's doing exactly the same actions as Duryodhana, shooting the bow, throwing the spear, but Arjuna's doing them, we hope, as a form of moksha dharma as well. He's coinciding kshatriya dharma with moksha dharma, living, working, and acting for the benefit of everybody, for the benefit of all living beings, is a form of yoga. And that's what Krishna adds to the whole understanding of the moksha dharma in the Bhagavad Gita, that moksha dharma doesn't necessarily entail physical withdrawal from the world to the monastery with the Buddhists, etc. That renunciation is a state of mind. It's not a physical position. And Krishna is quite critical of people who renounce the world physically but still have their minds a turmoil of raging desires. He says in chapter 3 verse 6, mityacharaha sa uchite, they're acting falsely. You know, they're living in the monastery, shave head, orange robes, but what they're thinking about is who's getting the most porridge for breakfast. How come he's got in the queue for breakfast before me? Mityacharaha sa uchite. Renunciation is a state of consciousness. It's not a physical position within the world. And by doing that, Krishna makes the point there. Lokasangraham evapi sampasyan kartamarhasi. Thinking of the welfare of the world. Kartamarhasi. You must take action. You must act. You mustn't withdraw from the world. Drawing together that. Now, when I first was writing in that book, Religious Doctrines in the Mahabharata, I thought at the time that Krishna had rejected Yudhishthira's ethics of virtue. And I thought that because at the beginning of chapter 2, after Arjuna's lamentation in chapter 1, Krishna says, don't become a eunuch, literally. Don't give up your manliness. It's not suitable. Give up this weakness of mind. He seemed to be taking on with Arjuna somewhat in Yudhishthira's position of lamenting over the evils of warfare. Krishna appears in those two verses 2 and 3 of chapter 2, to dismiss that as merely emotional weakness on Arjuna's part. And so when I wrote the book, I said that Krishna first rejects Yudhishthira's idea of virtue ethics, and then reconciles the idea of ethics as social, as dharma as social duty, with the moksha dharma by presenting the idea of a karma yoga. But I've changed my mind on that over the years. partly through thinking about it and partly through reading the Gita and other texts a lot more. And I'll come on to that point, why I think it's wrong that Krishna does not at all reject Yudhishthira's virtue, dharma as virtue. Just the opposite. He embraces it and draws it in. And just one point before we move on, I don't want to delay too long. When we see that question, and I'm sure many parents are asked this question about rituals and do we have to go to the temple and things like that? What's the point of these rituals, etc.? What are they doing? And then I remember I was at the Balaji temple a year or so ago talking at the youth camp there, and I was talking to a very nice young man, very pleasant young person, and we were discussing, and he said to me, I think Hinduism is really about being a good person. And it sounds such a bland statement. Is that all there is, being a good person? It's just what anybody might say. But I thought about that, and that reminds me then of another story in the Mahabharata. And this is why the Mahabharata is such a rich source of wisdom. And in this story, we have it's the story of the golden mongoose. I think I have it. I can't find it. I've got a comic of it anyway. I can get all my best information from comics. Never mind with Sanskrit books and things like that. Get a few Amar-Chitta-Katha comics and you'll be set up perfectly. But anyway, in this story, Yudhishthira, after the battle at Kurukshetra, being a virtuous person, he is mortified. Not literally, but he's deeply troubled by the suffering that he feels he has inflicted on others. So eventually Vyas advises him, perform a great ritual, a great yajna, sacrifice. And it's the biggest that's ever been performed, with golden vessels that they gather and hundreds of priests performing offerings into the fire. It's the greatest and grandest fire yajna that's ever been seen. And at the end of it, everybody's very satisfied with the successful accomplishment. And then they see an unusual creature, probably you know this story maybe, running across, and it's a mongoose, an extraordinary mongoose, because half of its body is gold in color. And they ask the mongoose, how did you come by this extraordinary appearance? And the mongoose can talk, actually. And he says, I used to live in a country where food was very short. And one time a starving guest came to the house of a poor family, and they shared the very last of their food with him to make sure that he didn't die of starvation. And a few grains of the chapatis they'd made and given to that man fell on the ground. And as I was running past, they touched my body and it turned to gold, half my body. And then he says, and since then I've been going to every place where a great ritual, a great dharma is occurring, and I roll on the ground seeking to make my other half of my body golden. But I've been here and I've seen this is the greatest ritual sacrifice, but look, I've rolled and rolled in the dust and it didn't work, no gold. And the key message there, I don't know if we're supposed to take this as literal truth or not, but the message there is that the act of kindness and self-sacrifice made by that family in sharing the last of their food with a starving person far outweighed in its dharmic capacity the great ritual performed by Yudhishthira. But what interests me particularly about that bit of the Mahabharata is that there are some manuscripts of the Mahabharata where another little bit has been added in which it says, and that mongoose was actually a wicked asura who had descended into this world to destroy the pure Vedic religion with his false teachings. And I think what's happened is that some later people have come to this text, and maybe because they're of a priestly disposition, they've found that idea that pure virtue excels ritual acts in dharmic excellence. They found it unacceptable, so they've added that little bit on to get their own word. And I think what that illustrates, the differing manuscript versions of the Mahabharata, again, is tensions over what is dharma. Is it a ritual act, or is it the pure virtue of Yudhishthira? So tensions arise. Let's though proceed now, because time is passing. And I wanted to talk particularly to contextualize the previous discussion within the context of the four Purusharthas. I'm sure most people have heard of them, and they are, of course, Kama, Artha, Dharma, and Moksha. And if we could take these briefly, and it's interesting that Indian wisdom, if you like, and going right back, these are referred to in the Gita, somewhat obliquely, but it's definitely understood there. Certainly in the Mahabharata in its introduction declares itself to be a text that includes all four. So this is a very ancient idea of four Purusharthas, four goals to be pursued in life. Let's take them. Karma means the pursuit of pleasure. Now, this is slightly questionable, perhaps, because in the Gita, Krishna is very critical of karma. But bear in mind, the Gita is a moksha shastra. And I'll come back to that again. But generally speaking, pleasure in the Indian traditions is not equated with sin, as it can be sometimes, particularly in the more austere forms of Christian religion. I saw a film once where on the Hebrides Islands in Scotland, which are very extreme Protestants, severe Protestants, they lock up the children's playground on Sundays, put padlocks on the swings, because you shouldn't be having any pleasure on a Sunday. Catholics, I think, are a bit more shall we say, open-minded. They go over for a drink in the pub after Mass. But there is that view that somehow enjoying the world is wicked and degrading. But the text, the idea of the Purusharthas says, no, not at all. We're in this world. It is legitimate for us to pursue pleasure. Even the texts on yoga say that there are two goals to be derived from yoga: pleasure in the form of physical enhancement, and also moksha, liberation as well. Both things are available from yoga. And of course, when the word Kama is mentioned, then of course one naturally thinks of the Kama Sutras. I have a copy here. Kama Sutras there, just for professional reasons, obviously. But what's interesting there is that the author of the Kama Sutras is, I've forgotten his name actually. Vatsyayana, who wrote the Kama Sutras, which are frankly about sexuality. He's not some kind of low-life Soho pimp creeping around the back streets. He's actually a really learned scholar whose other works are about the Nyaya system of philosophy, and they're widely admired as being some of the greatest expositions of Nyaya. And he's quite open, quite overt. Life is here, pleasure is here. Here I describe to you ways of enjoying pleasure. And I think Indian society traditionally was much more open about that. We all want to have a pleasing life in many different ways. And of course, karma isn't just sensuality. Karma is also the pleasure one gets from one's children. I'm sure those who are parents or even grandparents have experienced that pleasure when you see the small child run to you. That's karma. Or for me, thinking about my holidays next week, when I go down and walk across the cliff and see the waves crashing there in Cornwall or somewhere. Tremendous pleasure. That's also karma. The enjoyment of the world, listening to beautiful music, appreciating art, good company, all those things. These are wholly endorsed by Indian religion, karma. I'll make another point about that a bit later on. Secondly, we have artha. Artha is gaining prosperity, wealth, if you like, money. And the idea again is there's nothing greatly admirable about poverty. Poverty is sometimes an affliction that comes on, but it's not something that we should seek. poverty doesn't add anything. It doesn't enrich our lives unless it's religious renunciation, perhaps. Poverty isn't an affliction that we should seek to enjoy. So artha means it's perfectly legitimate to try through our endeavors to create a good life for ourselves and our families around us. That's perfectly legitimate and acceptable. But, and here comes the but, the caveat to that is, both karma and artha are given legitimacy by the simultaneous presence of dharma. Krishna says in chapter 7 of the Gita, when he's describing his presence in the world, his pervasion of the world, he says, Kamosmi Pratarshava. I am karma. I am that desire. But he makes a qualification on that. Dharma virudho. Bhuteshu Kamosmi Bharatarshava. He is only to be recognized in the form of karma when it's dharma aviruddha, when it does not transgress dharma. And if we go back and we look at dharma in the sense of virtue, pure virtue, that's the caveat, that's the qualification, that's the test. Karma is only legitimate when it is moderated by dharma. Because, and the same applies to artha as well. If we live in this world as hedonistic pleasure seekers, then at some point there is a conflict. My pursuit of pleasure against doing harm to other people, afflicting others. Dharma conflicts with the pursuit of karma. And at that point, karma is moderated by dharma. And that's the important point. Karma is legitimate, but only so long as there is a simultaneous presence of dharma to moderate karma. For example, if a young man, shall we say, is an out-and-out philanderer who likes to move through a succession of lady friends, what consideration does he have for them? Then that is dharma viruddha. He doesn't care about their feelings, doesn't care about their hurts and humiliations. All he's doing is that narrow-minded pursuit of pleasure, and I don't care how much affliction I cause to others. That's not acceptable. That's not a legitimate goal of life, because dharma is absent. Where dharma is absent, karma becomes illegitimate. That's the point. And similarly with artha as well. Artha stands poised. It can go in one of two directions. Where artha is combined with dharma, then there's a tremendous amount, so much that can be done for the loka sangraha, for the welfare of the world. People who have some money, who have been successful in the path of artha, they have a tremendous capacity towards dharma, to benefit others, to relieve others of their suffering, just as Yudhishthira did when he was king, ruling over it. His actions were dedicated, his artha, his possession of artha was dedicated to the benefit of all. If it goes the other way, when artha loses association with dharma, then it becomes simple avarice, greed, uncaring. So, for example, we hear about companies and individuals, they have women and children working 12, 14 hours a day in factories, earning a pittance, very little money, just so that the owner can get huge personal wealth. At that point, artha is not a legitimate goal. Artha becomes illegitimate because it's divorced from dharma. So the point would be that dharma sanitizes karma and artha. It renders them legitimate goals of life. When artha and karma are divorced from dharma, then they just become lust, avarice, greed, and they do great harm to other people. And we can see that all over the world. There are some people who have unbelievable wealth, while others are living in the most terrible poverty. And it's just not right. Anybody who stands back and looks, how can it be that this person has billions and billions of pounds, buying 3 yachts, 4 houses, islands in the Caribbean, and yet there's millions of people who are starving. How can that be a reflection of proper Dharma? And of course it isn't. Therefore, as I say, Artha is a legitimate goal. Karma is a legitimate goal, but only when they are combined, interwoven with the Dharma of pure virtue. Then they become legitimate. And then we can see some of the wealthiest people do incredible good for the world. Just as an example that touched my heart, particularly my friend Hemal Hanumandas, with whom I wrote this book, Pearls of Wisdom. He runs the charity Go Dharmic, and he just sent me an email today. We fed 15,000 people in Lagos in Nigeria. And I just thought of that, not just a bland statistic, but that's 15,000 people perhaps whose bellies were gnawing away with hunger, and many of them children as well, poor little things, starving, hungry, suffering. And just in that small way, by a commitment to Dharma, at least for some time, that suffering was alleviated. This is the power of Dharma, and it's also, of course, the power of Artha, because the money that paid for these feedings, which are going on every day, came from the accumulation of Artha. So Artha, when it's combined with Dharma, is an incredibly powerful force. And finally, I'm going to conclude now, and I'm sorry if I've gone on too long about this, but this is the most important bit. So if anyone's snoozing off, please pay attention for these last 5 minutes or so. Yeah, what about moksha? And very often it's presumed that moksha is higher than Dharma. And as I said, when I originally wrote that book, I think Krishna, in his advocacy of moksha dharma, had rejected Yudhishthira's virtue, but not at all. In fact, what's happened is that Yudhishthira's virtue ethics, if you like, his virtue interpretation of Dharma is absorbed and made an absolutely essential element of the moksha dharma. And the reason I say that is that if we read the texts on moksha, and if we read the texts, whether it be Jnana, the path of knowledge, or the path of bhakti, they are absolutely saturated with the idea of dharma that Yudhishthira advocates, to the point where one can say that just as artha and kama are rendered illegitimate by the absence of dharma, moksha, the pursuit of the highest spiritual goals, becomes impossible unless it is saturated in dharma. I was reading the Yoga Sutras the other day, and it uses the phrase dharma mega, the cloud of dharma that showers down on the spiritually awakened one. So let's take bhakti then, first of all, one of the two, I think, main paths to moksha, one of the two main forms of moksha dharma. Krishna makes a statement in the Gita. He says, Apichet sudaracharo bhajate mama nanyabhak sadhureva. Even if you're sudurachara, you're the most wicked actor, you perform the most wicked actions. Bhajate mama nanyabhak, he worships me, sadhureva. He then becomes a sadhu. By that, it seems to imply that the moksha dharma in the form of bhakti that Krishna is talking about, it transcends, it negates the need for dharma, because even if he's a sudurachara and he performs bhakti, then still he's a sadhu without any need, reference for dharma. That's wrong, because we read the next verse, verse 31, Kshipram bhavati dharmatma. He quickly becomes, Kshipram means quickly, bhavati, he is a dharma atma. Dharma atma. Krishna doesn't even say dharmacharin, a follower of dharma, but dharma atma, a person whose whole essential being is permeated by dharma. So the point would be that if this doesn't quickly take place, that you become dharma atma, then you're not doing bhakti. it's no use. If you're doing bhakti, worshipping, but your heart is still as hard as stone, then according to Krishna's definition in those verses, that's not bhakti. To be proper bhakti makes you a dharmatma. And dharmatma means not one who follows the rules of dharma, but one whose very essence is dharma, one whose whole consciousness. I'll come back to that in a minute. I also want to read this verse from the Shaivite perspective. This is what it says about the worship of Shiva. And we know worship of Shiva is generally conducted with linga puja, etc., rituals in many of the Shiva temples. But this is what the Vishnu Puran says. Sorry, the Shiva Puran says. I don't think we'll find this in the Vishnu Puran. I won't read the Sanskrit, I'll just read the English. They understand worship of Shiva. This is about Shivasya Aradhana, worship of Shiva. They understand worship of Shiva to consist of freeing all beings from fear, showing kindness to all beings, and providing assistance to all beings. That's how you worship Shiva. It's not about linga puja, it's about freeing others from fear, showing kindness to all beings, and providing assistance to other living beings. That's how to properly worship Shiva, proper bhakti. And he says, then he explains, as in this world a father is pleased when his sons, grandsons, and others are happy, so Shiva becomes pleased when happiness is given to any living being. Similarly, if harm is done to any living being, this act is displeasing to Ashtamurti Shiva. There is no doubt about this. So the Shiva Puran saying that if you worship Shiva, you want to be a Shiva Bhakta, then the best way is to provide help, comfort, assistance, upliftment to others. That's the most pleasing thing, more pleasing than any linga puja, any mantra chanting, etc. That's the proper, the most developed, pleasing form of Shiva worship. And then, so bhakti and dharma there, you can see in those verses, they are absolutely combined together. There is no worship of Shiva, however many pujas and flowers and glorious offerings you make to the linga. If you don't have the kindness to help other people, Shiva's not going to pay too much attention, because Shivasya Aradhanam is dharma, essentially, compassion. And I think the point is, and this is where I'll finish really, what is moksha in terms of jnana? Moksha is fundamentally, essentially, a transformation of consciousness. And that's what Shankaracharya preaches constantly. Change your consciousness from material absorption, being this sense of I, me, mine, etc. Change it to a higher form of consciousness. And that form of consciousness, that higher form, is utterly, absolutely benign and filled with love. In the Shaivite teachings from Tamil Nadu, the great Shaivite acharyas there, they talk about Shiva Rupa, developing your own Shiva Rupa. You become like Shiva in order to gain the moksha of being like Shiva, the Shiva consciousness, Shiva Rupa, Shiva form. And what is Shiva like? Well, I have a picture up there, but that's not what they're talking about. You become a fellow with stacked up hair and a trident and that. What they mean by that is Shiva Rupa means the supreme deity who is absolutely benign. That's what they say. Shiva is so filled with love for every living being. He's just longing for our well-being. It's said in the Shaiva Siddhanta that if you take one small move towards Shiva through some spiritual act, he takes 100 steps towards you. So much does he want to help all the time. So the point is cultivating that Shiva Rupa, which is the essence of moksha, means becoming benign and loving towards all living beings, just as Shiva is benign and loving to all living beings. It's that transformation of consciousness, and that transformation of consciousness means that one becomes It's Krishna says at the end of his teachings on yoga, in chapter 6, he gives the meditational yoga. But he says, what's the conclusion? That one comes to see every living being as the same as yourself. You see their happiness as your own joy. You see their suffering as their own suffering. So you can see how the whole concept of moksha is imbued with dharma. And the two are inseparable, to the point where dharma is moksha. The sadhana that brings moksha, the religious acts, are acts of dharma, freeing others from fear. Therefore, and I'll finish with this, if I could go on endlessly on this, but I'll conclude that there's a verse in chapter 7, which I think is very significant, of the Gita, in which Krishna encapsulates really what I've been trying to say. He says, it's verse 28, Yesham Tvantapatam Papam Jananam Punya Karmanam. He says, people who are Antagatam Papam, their wickedness, their papa is antagun, gone away. They don't perform any wicked acts at all. Jananam Punya Karmanam, they are people, Jana, who are Punya Karmanas. They perform righteous activities. So that's what he says. They don't do anything harmful to others. They constantly act in a way that is beneficial to others. Te dvandva moha nirmukta. Such persons become free, nirmukta, from dvandva moha, the duality, the illusion of duality. It's exactly what Shankaracharya is talking about, seeing oneness. But how do you do that? By not acting wickedly and performing punya karma. And bhajate mam dridabrata. They also worship me. So the path of knowledge and the path of bhakti are all then dependent upon dharma, in the form of doing what is righteous and avoiding what is harmful to others. So I think the point I've been trying to work towards here is that dharma gives legitimacy to karma and artha. It makes them true, it purifies them, it sanitizes them. And also moksha and dharma must go hand in hand. And if you find, and we see this so often, don't we, in the religious world, in India and outside, great proclamations of spiritual leadership, spiritual truth. But if you see, is there dharma there? Is it filled with dharma? Is there love for all beings in that group, that individual? If it's not there, it's not moksha dharma. It's just, we see it so often, just a kind of a shallow fashion accessory, not wishing to be too harsh, but we see this so much, don't we? Devious spirituality. And the clear test is, to what extent is that spirituality, or that claim of spirituality, imbued with dharma? That shows it's really spiritual. Otherwise, it's just some trickery, some vanity, or something like that, some person wanting to get a big reputation. So dharma is the essence, I would say. And I think back to that young man who said to me, Hinduism is about being a good person. It sounds such a small statement, but being a good person means that transformation of consciousness, which is the very essence of moksha. So he's absolutely right. He was my guru also, teaching me there in that statement. Learn all the time. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on for such a long time, but I'll finish there. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Okay.